I mean, everyone was much poorer, but the rich were still much richer than everyone else. And there's also something in there, you talked about identity, and I've watched this happen on the, what would you call it? Inevitable consequences of pathological thought front. So the leftists who were pushing for equality of outcome insisted that if there were differences in socioeconomic outcome that you could identify by group, then that was a prior evidence of systemic oppression, let's say. But they fell astray of a certain peculiarity with regards to group identity, which is that group identity is actually infinitely fragmentable. And so out of the initial identity political theorists, you got the intersectionalists who made the case that, well, you were oppressed, let's say if you were Latino, and you were oppressed if you were female, but the joint interaction between Latino and female made you even more especially oppressed, and then you could add gay to that or whatever other. And what you see happening on multiple fronts in consequence is that the litany of potential ethnic groups increases, the number of them, and then the number of interactions increases, and that increases exponentially as you add more identity categories. And what that essentially means is that the problem of computing equity starts to become technically impossible, because every single person's identity is so complex on the intersectional front that there isn't even a hypothetical way of deciding whether any given socioeconomic outcome is equitable. And so when I walked through that, I thought, well, Western culture had actually solved that problem several thousand years ago by pointing out that the appropriate level of analysis is the individual, because the individual has a unique identity that is in some sense a consequence of all their multiplicitous group identities, but singularly, what would you say, singularly representative of each individual. And so then you let individuals compete and cooperate in a fair market, and that's the best possible way of moving towards the right balance between equity and wealth. Well, there's a real attraction to a kind of deep narcissism there. And I think I first encountered that probably at Ivy League schools in the US. So I'm a Canadian and not that familiar with the more differentiated class structure in the US. And so when I went down to teach at Harvard, it was an anthropological adventure for me, as well as let's call it a research-oriented adventure and an intellectual adventure. And I didn't understand as much as I do now what dynamic the Ivy League schools played in the US in terms of ensuring upward mobility. And I knew at Harvard, I believe it was when I was there in the 90s, the estimate was that 40% of Harvard undergraduates would be billionaires by the age of 40. And that was 30 years ago. And so that was quite a substantial amount of money then. And the whole point is that if you got into an Ivy League school, as soon as you got in, you were basically a member of the 1%. Now, you might have been a junior member, but you were definitely a member. And I thought that was perfectly fine because the Ivy Leagues did a damn fine job of merit-based selection. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were legacy students, for example, and there was a bit of play in the system there, but fundamentally, Harvard and the other Ivy Leagues had transformed themselves from old boys clubs in the 1960s into highly elite intellectual institutions by the 1990s. But then what I saw too, and this was so interesting, was that being junior members of the 1%, with almost certain hallmark of long-term success as a consequence of Ivy League admission, wasn't enough for many students and their idiot professors. They had to have the label of oppressed working for them too. So you had this strange spectacle, as far as I was concerned, of these unbelievably fortunate Ivy League students who were offered an opportunity that, well, is really unparalleled in human history, not only benefiting as a consequence of being the beneficiaries of this amazing system, but simultaneously claiming the status of the poor and oppressed, and claiming at the same time to be avatars and representatives of that oppressed group. And I thought, Jesus, you guys, like being rich and powerful in junior form isn't enough for you. You have to have all the virtues of the rich and all the privileges and opportunities, and you have to have all the virtues of the poor and oppressed at the same time. It's like that just seems to me to be a bit much, and you see that reflected in the people that you're describing, who have this unbelievable wealth and opportunity, and who yet put themselves forward as, canonical victims of an oppressive system. So we could let's talk technically for a minute, so that everybody can understand what these selection criteria actually mean. So you could define a meritocratic selection process technically. Say, imagine you have an outcome. So you need an outcome first, which might be job performance or net lifetime productivity, something like that. And you can very much argue about what the outcome variable should be, but it's generally associated with something like economic productivity. And having made that measure, so that might be income, it might be number of people you employ in your lifetime, might be number of businesses that you generate, might be number of creative enterprises that you engage in. There's a variety of different measures of, say, lifetime productive and creative output. And then you could say that you use a meritocratic selection process if you use a statistical procedure that has been linked to that outcome measure. And so you might say, for example, are there things we can measure that predict lifetime creative or productive capacity? And the answer is, well, yes, we actually know what they are. So one of them is general cognitive ability, which is often assessed with IQ tests or SATs or MCATs or GREs, standardized tests. And the other is personality, with a secondary, what would you say, contributor of interest. And so people who are productive have high general cognitive ability, which can be assessed quite rapidly. They tend to be conscientious, which is a personality trait, and that makes them good managers and administrators, or they tend to be high in openness, and that makes them creative entrepreneurs. And it also helps to some degree to be somewhat free of negative emotion. And those are basically the category of predictors. On the interest front, you have interest in people versus interest in things. And the interest in things types tend to be more frequently male, and they tend to pursue the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics streams. And so we actually know how to select people on the basis of merit. We do general cognitive ability testing and personality and interest, and you can provide a very economically valuable service to each individual and to the state at large by selecting according to those criteria, because you then select people who can benefit most radically from being put with their peers and from education. And the data on this are crystal clear. Now, the alternative, I've talked to people like Adrian Wooldridge about this, and you touch on it as well in your book on citizenship. You might say, well, what's the alternative to meritocracy? And Wooldridge's hypothesis was that in the absence of a technical meritocracy, you reverted to dynasty, so it's aristocratic transmission of status, or nepotism, which you talked about already in relationship to kinship. And so as soon as you abandon the merit principle, you open up the grounds, in all likelihood, to all sorts of corrupt admission processes. And so the universities are going to be wrestling with that. They already are, because one of the ways they discriminate against Asians, which is everyone's loss, right, to not maximize our exploitation of the productive and competent Asians, let's say, the way they discriminate against them is by deeming certain stereotypical Asian personality traits as not appropriate on the personality front. And they do that to gerrymander the admission criteria on the basis of race.